Hi, this is Jonathan Slater, host of Tête-à-Tête, Conversations in Canadian Jewish Studies. Tête-à-Tête is a production of the Association for Canadian Jewish Studies, Association d'études juives canadiennes. It's inevitable, perhaps intentional, that a podcast on conversations in Canadian Jewish Studies will devote a fair amount of time to the subject of Jewish culture. That's culture with a small c, and the ways that culture is interwoven into Jewish life in Canada. However, there's also the matter of Jewish culture with a capital C. But I'll admit, we haven't really delved into the world of contemporary Canadian Jewish performance, particularly the ways certain artists are maintaining Yiddish as the creative language of song and stage.
Spend my love making love to you night and day. Tag och natt, dag och natt. Bist du noch mein? När du bist unter die Sonne und Leben schein. Sieh nu en zu mir oder weit. Es macht nicht mein Teire, wie du bist heint, ihr Tracht von dir, Tag und Nacht.
That was Night and Day, interpreted by my guest today on the podcast, the talented and award-winning Canadian actress, playwright, and singer, Theresa Tova. Tova has performed on stage, the big screen, and television. Her musical, Still the Night, which centers on the story of two young girls surviving the Holocaust in the forests of Poland, was a shortlisted finalist for the Governor General's Award for English Language Drama and won 4 Dora Mavor Moore Awards, which I understand is Toronto's equivalent of a Tony. Then in 2025, Theresa received the King Charles III Coronation Medal for her service to the arts in Canada. Born in Paris, raised in Calgary, Theresa resides in Toronto, where in a matter of a few short weeks, she'll be taking the stage in a Yiddish language production of Fiddler on the Roof, directed by Joel Grey, in which she'll be starring as Yente. Theresa, welcome to Tête-à-Tête.
Shenem Dank. Thank you so much for having me. Oh my God, it puts such a smile on my face hearing that jazzy rendition of Tag und Nacht. Thanks for playing that.
Yeah, I was dancing.
Yes, I always say we call it schwing.
Schwing, yeah. Well, I know we could spend hours talking about your distinguished career and impressive accomplishments, many, if not most of which have contributed to the Jewish cultural scene in Canada, but equally to the Canadian cultural scene writ large. However, I want to focus in on a few productions in our conversation today that you've been intimately involved in. First, let's talk about Singing Through the Darkness. Singing Through the Darkness, a concert that ran in conjunction with the Auschwitz Not Long Ago, Not Far Away exhibition at the Royal Ontario Museum in January 2026. The concert was linked to the ROM exhibit that housed hundreds of original artifacts from the Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum. Would you share more about that undertaking with our listeners?
It was such a moving time to be asked during this challenging time for Jews in this country to be asked to produce a show inspired by the Holocaust. And they brought 4 amazing women together, all of which I just absolutely love in the Yiddish world. Lenka Lichtenberg, Aviva Chernik, Fern Linzen, and then a guest star of Judith Lander, the amazing Judith Lander, and myself to each come to the material from a different perspective. We all have different ways in. My way is as a second generation daughter of survivors. I grew up speaking Yiddish and have researched these songs and written shows about my mother, which you mentioned, using the songs written by Holocaust survivors. So these are very favorite, wonderful tunes, incredible songs by the great Litvak authors and Vilna playwrights during the war. Others came at it through Ladino. One of the other gals came through it through her great aunts who sang in the concentration camps. So we all had personal stories to tell. And it's not about suffering, this show, it was about resilience. And it was such a profound experience to take such a personal approach to this material. And I was blown away, actually, that the ROM would ask us to do it and then that the audience has embraced it so well. We sold out in 20 minutes and we ended up having to
Wow.
do 2 extra shows. And then we've since remounted it at a bigger theater, and now we're talking about touring next year.
Where was that playing originally?
It was at the ROM, at their C5 venue at the top of the ROM with these beautiful, the Crystal Palace windows looking out onto the city.
So it was actually in the ROM.
In the ROM, and the audience got to buy a ticket to it and then have a private tour with a docent through the exhibit after hearing the music from the period and the time. And we did some original stuff too. I mean, I wrote some stuff with John Alcorn for Still the Night about the ownership of stories and my generation taking on the telling of those stories. So yeah, there were songs in Czech, in Ladino, in Yiddish, in English, and yeah, it's a very special project, and I do hope it continues to have a life the producers want it to. So that's good.
That's fantastic. Wow. Had I known about it, I'm sorry that I missed that because
Well, maybe it'll play Montreal.
maybe it will, but that, I would have hopped on a train to see that. But you talked about your collaborators, your co-stars. I want to talk about another collaboration event. Let's talk about the Three Yiddish Divas for a few minutes. Now, for our listeners who are unfamiliar, the Three Yiddish Divas was a group that you had been part of with Joanne Bort and the late
Yes.
Adrian Cooper. You all toured the world singing a mix of traditional and contemporary Yiddish songs in an effort to bring a taste of Yiddish culture to audiences around the globe. So here's the question, Tova. During that tour, you sang in certain places where, in the course of the Second World War, Yiddish had been largely, if not completely, eradicated. What did that mean to you to be doing that in such places?
It was frightening, chilling, to be able to fly into Germany, to be able to perform there and in Poland, where my mother came from, where her whole family was erased, and to go into those museums and to be embraced by 5,000 odd Poles at a time coming to hear us sing at these huge venues. What was it? The Platz right outside the Warsaw Ghetto, the only remaining streets of the Warsaw Ghetto that the Lauder family maintained. And at the end of that, there's a Platz, and 5,000 people come to hear Yiddish divas going, "You didn't get rid of us. We're still here."
What was the reaction of that audience? I'm just curious. How did the audience react?
Oh, they love Yiddish. I mean, we were on national television in Warsaw, and I was in the airport the next day, and people are coming up and going, "You're the Yiddish singer. We love Yiddish." I mean, it's just like, it's not what I would have expected. And yet there was a contradiction as well, because we played Vienna, for instance, the Three Yiddish Divas, and in our hotel room, one of the chambermaids refused to clean my glass.
What?
And when I asked her in my Yiddish, which I know she can understand from her German, "Entschuldige mir, can you huben rein Glas?" I say it with a more German accent than I would normally use. And she says to me, "You'll clean it yourself, Jew."
Really?
Yeah.
My goodness. What was your response to that? What was your response? I'm just
I
curious.
was shocked. I was stunned. I just realized I'm in the birthplace of Hitler, and it's just what it is. I mean, but I've done this before. I've played Paris before, where I've been during. I'm doing a small event. This is not the Yiddish Divas, but let me give this as an example. I'm doing I've traveled the world as the Yiddish Diva alone, plus with the three of us. But I'm doing this concert in Paris at the Yiddish Medem Center, or one of those places, and there's a huge demonstration, a manifestation on the streets, hundreds and hundreds of people chanting anti-Israel slogans, anti the president at the time, I think it was Reagan, and, just death to Jews and all of this. And I'm thinking, who's going to come hear my concert against that? And 250 people showed
Fantastic.
in this little Yiddish center in the heart of Paris. And here I am proudly saying I'm Jewish in these environments. I was in Luxembourg. I did a little concert in Luxembourg, and I wasn't told by my manager until after the event, but the police were at the door because the venue had gotten death threats because they had programmed the Yiddish diva, Theresa Tova, and people came. And so there is something about, and it's not just Jews. And I got to say that it's not just Jews who come. The 5,000 in Poland, very few of them were Jewish, but they love Yiddish. And at the time, the president of Poland was actually studying to speak Yiddish.
Really?
I don't know why. But there's contradictions, you're in places like Warsaw and you see velvet paintings in restaurants, in Polish restaurants, with kind of Shakespearean Shylock figures with big noses holding coins. And this is now, a luck figure,
Right. They have these little figurines too, don't they?
Yeah. And you're going, what is this about? It's kind of like a Jewish Disneyland, but in this weird, and they hire Poles to dress as religious Jews and walk the streets of
my
the
goodness.
festival. And,
My goodness.
so there is a contradiction that I have to come to terms with. But at the same time, as a daughter of Warsaw, I am so emboldened by the ability to stand, not as a victim, but as a daughter of survivors, and to say, we're here. I'm proud to be a Polish Jew, and I'm still here, and I'm glad you're coming to hear me show you who we are. You didn't get rid of us.
And you're on stage and you're belting it out in the language that no longer is belted out in the streets of Warsaw.
At all.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Wow.
And to be able to be at Mila 18, my mother's family was Mila 24, to be able to go and visit those streets and to say, yeah, we were removed from here. And it's tough to be a Jew in Warsaw, I got to say.
Yeah, in Warsaw, and it's starting to get tougher in a lot of other places these days.
My first invitation to Argentina was to do a fundraiser because of the big bombing that happened in the 80s, right, of the Jewish Cultural Center down there.
That's right.
And it was, a couple of decades later, but they invited me to come down and do a big concert. We sold out 2 600-seat theaters, 2 nights of Yiddish music. So there is a desire. I mean, the difference is, I think, that I'm a storyteller. I'm an actress. I love songs that talk about love and joy, and I'm going to use the word again, resilience. But also the comedy too, the songs that created Broadway, the Great American Songbook. I mean, I also take songs like that, like The Night and Day, and translate it with friends or by myself into Yiddish, because most of those composers and lyricists were Jewish, although Night and Day was not.
But it sounded great. I mean, that was the first time that I've heard Night and Day with a Yiddish rendition, and it sounded fantastic.
Sounds pretty good in Yiddish, doesn't it, Jonathan?
Yeah, it does. It really does.
And I got to say that Cole Porter, in his autobiography, said, when I had to learn to write for Broadway, all I had to learn was to write Jewish. So there you go.
So let's talk about radio. About 20 years ago, during my teaching career, I embarked on a project where I was investigating the connections between mass media and the Jewish experience during the 20th century, looking, for instance, at the impact of radio on Jewish life, and this was in the United States, on Jewish life in the U.S. in the interwar years. And I gave several talks on the subject, but I'm embarrassed to say I knew very little of the rich history of the relationship of Jews and radio here in Canada, roughly at the same time. Now, you've written and directed a musical, The Jewish Radio Hour, that references and pays tribute to the many years of the Jewish Radio Hour programs that were broadcast from Toronto, Hamilton, and St. Catharines, Ontario, from the 1930s through the early 1950s. And characters in the musical are based on personalities who were part of the original radio shows. Now, I was reading about this production. Putting that show together must have involved an incredible amount of research and digging on your part. So, tell us about the process of assembling that collage of programming into a musical story that shines a light on vintage Canadian Jewish radio.
It was, you're bringing up such memories for me. I'm sitting here quelling just thinking about those experiences. It took a good 6 months. I reached out to the Jewish community. First of all, I was commissioned to write this piece by Mitch Smolkin, another Yiddish singer who was at the time running Ashkenaz, the big festival that happens every 2 years at Harborfront in Toronto. And he wanted me to do something based on the Yiddish radio hours and those Sunday programs. And the Yiddish Radio Stunde, the Yiddish radio hour. And so I reached out to friends I knew. And at the time, many of the performers, the announcers, and family of those folks were still alive.
That's great.
And you would not believe the interviews I took and did with people who Molly Friedman, and she came on as a little girl and she did things like and she would did and she would perform her whole Lazzi for me in her living room in Hamilton. Or the announcers, or the best was we had one of the great, there was 8 competing radio hours at different times around the Golden Horseshoe, around the Great Lakes, and they stole from each other. It's the new Jewish radio hour with the same people, but what they would do is they would go to the Strand Theater on, I think it's called the Strand, on Spadina Avenue, but they had traveling groups that would come up. Molly Pekin would come up to perform, and the Yiddish community would go, and he would go in and talk to them and drive them the hour down to do the radio hour on their day off. He would get them down there as well. So they had some great people on there. And Harry Harris was a cantor who lost his voice at one point, and he started the Jewish radio hour. It came out of the left-leaning socialist groups at Nijeveld, and they would perform there, and then he'd go and steal those people to come down to Hamilton. And his family, I went to interview them because they had some of his personal belongings, and they actually handed me 78s. Is that what they would have been? That I had to take to the CBC for them to format them so I could actually hear them, because who has a 78 disc player anymore? And what they were was the actual commercials that he played on the air.
Wow.
So I was able to actually use them as my source material. And then I scoured Yiddish newspapers from the time. And so it was just hilarious. And then he also, in that box, and it was just a paper cardboard box that he gave me, there was a 5-page handwritten in Yiddish, handwritten letter from Harry Harris about the creation of the Yiddish radio hour and then the beginning of its demise. And he cut it off and he never talked about it. So the letter was never finished, but I had his own voice. And I was very, very proud of being able to interview these folks, to steal from the best because they were the best, and to cobble together this beautiful show that was just about 6 folks and their musicians coming in and actually doing a 1-hour radio show, which basically timed out to 1 hour and 15, but we stretched time to give them a good show.
That must have been an amazing experience. Wow.
It was so amazing. And I had so many non-Jewish, non-Yiddish speaking friends come to see it who went, that was one of the funniest things I've ever seen in my life. I mean, there was a Lazzi that Harvey Atkin gave me about 2 Polish Jews going to see their first baseball game. And it's all in Yiddish, but it's hilarious. It's just hilarious, So anyway, beautiful stuff. And really just to be able to tell our stories the way they would have been imagined back then was very moving.
And just set the time. When was this happening?
So this was the early 30s, and I didn't take it anywhere past the beginning of the war. I didn't want it to be a sad thing. So, but there was the connection between these folks and reaching out to the Vilna playwrights and the Vilna academics. And there was a section on the radio every week, letters that came from Europe. But we had those elements as well. And yeah, it was lovely. And we did that about, I got to say, we remounted it so many times because there was such an appetite for it. Yeah.
Were you doing this in one venue, or was it multiple venues?
No, many times, years apart. The Workman's Circle asked us to do a version of it for their 75th anniversary of the organization. Another producer came and saw it, and years later wrote, says, I can't get it out of my mind. Can I produce it? And we did a 4-night stand at a big theater in Richmond Hill. We did another one up in North. And so it's a wonderful piece. I was very, very
So
proud
is it time
of
to bring it back? Is it time to bring it back?
Maybe.
I'll go. I love Jewish radio. I grew up in New York City, just at the end of radio in New York.
Yeah. Well, we really were, as a people, our creatives were so fundamental in creating Broadway and, great music and great American songbooks and all that. So yes, our stories are very entertaining. And even my Holocaust musical, Still the Night, had so much joy in it, as well as telling the story. But we must always balance it with the joy that we have as a people.
Hi, I'm Chamutal Dotan, editor-in-chief of Scribe Quarterly, the magazine published by the Canadian Jewish News. I've long believed that one of the great and underdeveloped roles that magazines can play in our culture is fostering connections between academics and the broader public. That they can facilitate a kind of translation between the important but sometimes technical work that researchers do and the communities that are interested in that work but don't encounter it on a regular basis. That's why I'm so glad to announce a new collaboration between Scribe Quarterly and the Association for Canadian Jewish Studies. Starting with the spring issue of Scribe Quarterly, now available online and in print, we'll be publishing short, accessible summaries of recent work published in Canadian Jewish Studies. Written by the original researchers, but designed for readers of all backgrounds, these bulletins will provide anyone who is interested with clear, easy-to-understand snapshots of what is new and exciting in academic research into all things Jewish and Canadian. To read the latest issue of Scribe Quarterly and see this new collaboration for yourself, head on over to thecjn.ca, where you can browse through a digital edition of the magazine or subscribe to receive it in print for free.
See, they twinkle very faintly from my dismal cellar view, and I crave a peaceful corner to reflect them back to you. Und ich hab gar nicht kein Winkel, sie zu schenken dir zurück.
That was Theresa Tova singing Under Your White Stars, a translation of the Yiddish song Unter deine weiße Stern. Theresa, let's go back to 1997. You write and produce a multi-award-winning musical drama, Still the Night. This is a survival story of two girls separated from their parents during the Second World War who wind up wandering around Poland pretending not to be Jewish. 2 questions. First, what led you to create this work? And what were the ideas you wanted to convey and the experiences you thought audiences needed to feel as they engaged with the performance?
The first question is easier. What brought me to this work was living as a daughter of a Holocaust survivor who spent almost every single night of her life screaming into the dark at night with nightmares and talking to her parents who she lost when she was 14 years old because they took themselves back into the ghetto and left her to survive. And her cry for years was, "Why didn't you take me with you?" She always regretted that she was left to live.
Oh, it's chilling.
And hearing her stories every single day of my life in that world, I mean, she would always reference the Holocaust no matter what was happening. Walk faster. What do you mean? I had to walk fast in the war. You know, it's always referenced. And I think those experiences are what made me an actor. It's what made me emotionally mature at 17 years old to be able to join theater companies and to be able to start working. I had a maturity that other 17-year-olds wouldn't have to be able to access this kind of work. And these are stories that, as a feminist, I'd been sharing with friends and in, like, I used to say like cocktail chatter, but it's not like I went to cocktail parties. But, for years, these were my mother's stories of survival, and they were amazing to me. That she had bullet holes up and down her legs, that her nails didn't grow because of what the Gestapo did to her, that she smuggled herself on top of a train into Paris after 5 years hiding in the woods. And I got to say that when I started singing in Yiddish, when I was asked by the Jewish community here to come to Holocaust remembrance events and actually sing in Yiddish, it dawned on me that I had a way to tell my mother's story, because I'm a singer and the people in the Holocaust were writing these songs. Herrsch Glick, Still the Night. Herrsch Glick, the Partisano song. Under Your White Starry Heaven, that was written by a Vilna author, Abraham Sutzkever, the one you just played. And I went down to New York and I researched with Chaim Lotek et Yivo, the greatest musicologist. Her son runs the Volksbühne Yiddish Theater, by the way, that's bringing Fiddler up here. And I went and sat with her for 2 weeks and talked through songs and said, I need a song here. I need a song when the first day they're in the woods. I'm thinking it should be this song, but do you think there's something better that I don't know? And she'd go, no, nothing better. That's the one you should use. Oh God, it was such a project of love and personal exploration. And I worked with the amazing Anne Englund to begin with, and the amazing actor Liza Balkan, and I told my stories and we would improvise them in a rehearsal hall. We did that for about 2 weeks, and I recorded everything. And then I went back and I wrote the show, crying my eyes out and really just trying to be honest about growing up the daughter of a survivor and showing the heroism that these women had in the time of war. And I did believe at the time that that's a story we were not hearing about women in war. You were hearing about the concentration camps. You were hearing about hidden children. You were not hearing about 14-year-olds who got their periods in the woods and grew breasts and were raped and used and abused and somehow survived.
So the story of these girls are teenagers in the story. How old are they?
It starts when they're 14 years old, and they come from very privileged lives. My mother came from a well-to-do family in Warsaw, and there's still no survival for them. And then they ended up running into the woods, these two young girls, two cousins, the same first name. And I had gone to Israel in my university years, and I had met my mother's cousin, who she spent 5 years in the woods with. And I had the most incredible conversations with her that really saved my life, because my mother, unfortunately, was a bitter woman from everything she'd lived through. And when I met little Bronke, my mother was tall and statuesque like myself, but when I met little Bronke in Israel, she was so different than my mother, having lived through the same horrors. She believed in love, she believed in life, and she didn't hold the world responsible for her own happiness.
So it was a sort of a redemption for you.
Absolutely. And what's funny about it, Jonathan, is that the night before we opened that show, I tried to protect myself because it was so personal, and I'm playing my mother. and I'm playing myself, and I'm playing my mother as a 14-year-old, and I'm playing myself as a 17-year-old. And these are very, very personal stories. And I wrote a review of Still the Night for myself the night before we opened. The review I wrote was the worst review I thought I could get. And it was, "Nice piece of therapy, Miss Tova. What's it got to do with the rest of us?" And I did. I imagined that review so that nothing they said could be any worse than that or could hurt me. And then luckily, it was very, very well received and embraced, and had 8 productions across the country.
So what was the takeaway for the audience? What did you want the audience to come away with from this production? Because clearly you were working through something, but what did you want the audience to work through?
I don't know. And I don't know that any writer actually goes with that in mind. You find that out later as to what you were saying. But as you're in the middle of it, what you want to do is explore your truth. I truly believe this, Jonathan. The more specific you are about your personal storytelling, the more universal it becomes, because then others can relate. If you're going with big, lofty ideals, how can you relate to that? But a personal story of a 14-year-old trying to make sense. And to me, my mother was a hero. To herself, she was ashamed of what she did. And that's, I guess, what I went into it with, if anything at all. It was that I need to show how amazing she was. Betty Friedan had nothing on my mother. Is and then as a woman who, as a young girl who grew up through the 70s, too young for the 60s, okay, that big drug generation, but my generation was the love generation. And when my mother was so embarrassed to even talk about it, the fact that she'd been gang raped by how many men, how many times, and gave birth to babies
Oy.
in the woods. I mean, that's the story of women in war that nobody was talking about.
Yeah.
So, and I, it's terrible. But I used to say, I want you to hear these stories because you know what? As a woman in the 70s, I fucked men for a lot less than my life. And that's the truth. And what I loved about being so personal and being so honest about those stories is that I had great Holocaust academics say to me, "This is the work of the next generation. This is what we have not talked about yet." And so what was amazing to me is that I think there's a lot of reticence in audiences when they hear something is a Holocaust theme. They, even Holocaust survivor children, they don't want to go see it because they know it's going to hurt them. And then what I'm most proud of is that we had so many people coming to see it 3 and 4 times because they would bring their mothers or they'd bring their children, and they go, "No, you have to come with me. You have to come. You must see this."
Yeah. So it was very effective from that point of view.
It was. And I still have people going, "When are you going to bring it back?" I mean, I wouldn't be able to play the 14-year-old anymore. And I was so blessed to have Liza Balkin, this great, great actor, working with me. She was just amazing. And the great John Alcorn. And we wrote songs for it and developed this music and developed the translations. And it was really, really important.
Now, you were talking about as you were preparing, as you were developing the musical, that you improv'd.
Yes.
To build it. And if I remember correctly, you were a guest at a class at York University at one point dealing with improvisation on the Holocaust. Could you just refresh my memory on that? And,
Oh
and
my
and what was that
gosh.
like? What was going on in that
It's just
classroom?
that after Still the Night, there's a Professor Bellery Zatzman, just a beautiful woman. And she was teaching up at York University, and she was teaching a course called Improvisation in the Holocaust.
Okay, so I got it right.
You
All
got
right.
it right. And she brought me up, I think, in total, maybe 4 or 5 times, like every 2, 3 years when her classes got to their second or third year where they had to start developing their own material. She would bring me in to talk about the process of developing Still the Night and inspiring them and talking to them. And she, always say it's an hour and a half class. And I go, right. It never lasted less than 3 hours. And some amazing playwrights came out of there. What blew me away about that course was that so many of them, most of them, were not Jewish. So you're talking about folks who are relating to that from their own personal cultural history of what do you do with your parents' stories? What do you do with the trauma that they inadvertently or however have passed on? What do you do with those lessons, and how do you make your way as a loving human being rather than full of hate? It's funny, I shouldn't say this, but my daughter, I brought her with me to Switzerland one time. I was teaching Yiddish songs in the Alps in Switzerland, and I was bringing I think she was 12 or something, and I brought her with me, and she goes, "You're going to teach people? What are you going to teach people? To be you? Like, what are you going to teach them?" And then came to see my first class, and she came out and went, "Well, actually, that was pretty cool, Mom." Yeah, so okay, got it. Okay.
Well, I guess if you can rock a cynical child, you can do anything you want.
Well, do you know what's fun is when you tour Europe with these Yiddish Diva concerts and my other concerts, it's interesting. It's so different than here. They really want you to relate to their audiences, and they actually plan that you're going to teach 2 master classes the day before, the day after, and people come from all walks of
Interesting.
life in Holland, in Switzerland, everywhere to actually learn from the performer. And it's I just love coaching. I love teaching, and yeah.
What a great tradition
Mhm.
that
Isn't
is.
it
Wow.
wonderful? Really lovely. And so they get to know you as a performer too. It's not this you and I, this separation. It's very personal. And I think that's why they've cultivated such great consumers of culture, because they're personally involved. So in Holland, to do a family holiday, you would go to a Yiddish music camp for a week. It's something just so foreign to me, but when I was part of it, it was like, okay, now I get it. Now I get it. Yeah.
Hi there. My name is Joshua Tapper, and I'm the Executive Director of the Association for Canadian Jewish Studies. I want to tell you about a thrilling new initiative we're launching at the ACJS in spring 2026 called the Canadian Jewish Life Writing Project. It's an effort to encourage more Jewish Canadians to write about their own pasts, to think about the entanglements of their Canadian and Jewish identities, and how their experience as Jews has informed their sense of understanding of what it means to be Canadian, and vice versa. With the project, we're putting out a national call for short autobiographical essays that will later archive, digitize, and make freely accessible for anyone to read and research. In this first year of the project, we're asking writers to reflect on the theme of growing up Jewish in Canada. To learn more about the Canadian Jewish Life Writing Project, please visit acjs-aejc.ca/lifewriting or click on the link in the show notes. We look forward to reading your Canadian Jewish story.
Well, since we're talking about York University, I'm co-chairing the ACJS conference at York at the end of May to the beginning of June. And I know I'll have to stay in Toronto past the conference, at least a couple of extra days, if I want to see you in the Harold Green Jewish Theatre Company's production of Fiddler, which runs pretty much coincident with the conference from May 25th through June 7th, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
It'll be in Yiddish. I remember seeing it when I was a kid on Broadway in English, but it'll be in Yiddish, but with English and Yiddish subtitles. So what does it mean to be part of an all-Canadian cast in a musical that's become such a cultural cachet, but also perhaps the most widely known depiction of pre-war Eastern European Jewry?
It means everything. To be able to work in my mother tongue, first of all, because I actually speak Yiddish. By the way, I have to change my accent because the Volksbühne, People's Theater out of New York, which developed this, I think in 2018, was it 2018, 2019, somewhere there originally, and has been doing different productions of it. This is them bringing this production, directed by Joel Grey, to Canada. They're bringing Stephen Sky Bell, who starred as Tevye on Broadway, to Canada to do his role again. But the rest of the cast, you're absolutely right, is from across the country, all Canadian. And some of my favorite actors and a bunch of new ones I don't know. But the folks, I've worked for them before, and it's amazing. I have not seen this production. Many Canadians flew down to see it in New York who tell me that it was the best production of Fiddler they'd ever seen. Imagine doing it in Sholem Aleichem's mother tongue that he wrote the original stories
That's
in,
right. Mama
the
Lotion.
Mama
Yeah.
Lotion. And I gather the way they do the subtitles is not just like in opera where you're looking up or looking down, but they've got big screens behind and you're basically looking at the action and reading at the same time. You're not having to choose where you look.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So they're doing it differently, I gather, from what I've seen of the photos from the New York productions. And I'm so excited.
So let's talk about Yente, because this character that you're playing is very iconic. It's a very pivotal character in the music. So how are you getting ready for the role of Yente? And what are you looking forward to in preparation for taking to the stage?
I wanted this show so badly. And I had so many people reaching out to me going, of course you're going to be in it. And I go, stop, you're jinxing it. Who knows? You never know. But this is the fourth production of Fiddler I'll have done. I did it originally when I was 17 years old in high school production, which was a very good production, I got to say. Although when I look back I still have pictures of it with my, the drawn in bags under the eyes to play Yente.
Yeah, that was the limit to my acting career. High school. I was in musicals in my local YMYWHA, and that was it.
All the world's a stage.
That's right.
So I played her first when I was 17 years old. And then I guess, when was it? 2000? Oh my God, 23 years ago. I did it in the Susan Schulman directed, Brent Carver starring as Tevye production at Stratford. And I also played Yente. Tried to get them to let me do Golda. They wouldn't even hear of it. And then 2 years ago, I did it again for a company in rural Ontario called Drayton, and they do beautiful work. And I played it there in a beautiful production of it as well. So this will be my fourth time playing the same part. But of course, what I bring to it as a woman of a certain age now is going to be very different than a 17-year-old.
Right. It must be different each time that you approach this character.
Well, I've already had one session with the folks from New York, with Motel Didner, who is working on preparing my accent, because this was translated in the 60s in Israel for a production there. And there's a lot of old Yiddish from the Russian, from Sholem Aleichem's time. There's a lot of Loshen Kodesh, which is Hebrew, which I do not speak. I speak Yiddish, so there's some words I have to look up and don't know. And then there's just the accent, the pronunciation. So I speak a fließendike Polish and Yiddish, which is the way I speak, and they want a more Yivo Yiddish.
What does that mean? More Yivo Yiddish, more Germanic?
It's actually, if I'm not mistaken, it's kind of out of the Vilna where Yivo was born. It's a more highbrow Yiddish, but not German. It's like in English, they've standardized. What they did, Yivo, is they standardized Yiddish when they teach it, and yet for Fiddler, I will absolutely do what they ask of me. But personally, I prefer to speak my own dialect. Hitler killed 3 million Polish Jews. Why should I help kill the rest of us by not speaking my Polish Yiddish?
Wow.
Wow,
yeah.
Well, does that shock you? But it feels that way sometimes. But does that not make sense? I actually had a rabbi at the opening of Still the Night say to me, I loved your show, but could you not speak a better Yiddish? And I went, really, Rabbi? Really? I can't speak my good Yiddish because it's not your Yiddish? Like, how many English accents are there in the world? Like, why are we so anti-Semitic against our own?
Well, it's interesting that you bring this up. Just a quick personal story. I remember going to see the premiere of Hester Street with my dad,
oh, yeah.
who grew up in a Yiddish-speaking household, and he was not happy with the way they spoke Yiddish in the film.
Because it was inconsistent. So to me, the Yivo Yiddish, and please don't listen to this, everybody who's producing me in Fiddler, but to me, speaking a Yivo Yiddish, I can do it, but it's like speaking English with a poker up my ass. You know, I can't just be easygoing. It's like the King's English. RP, you're going to speak English this way. It's very, very pronounced and very, very exacting. And it just doesn't, it's not the way I was brought up. So, but I was taught both. I went to a Yiddish school that also taught that, but I went between the two because I spoke my Yiddish in the home. But anyway, I think it's just going to be stunning. We're in the Elgin Theater, which is a 1,600 seat theater. I mean, unbelievable. And I just really hope that it is as well received here as it was in New York, but I'm sure it will. It's a great team. Zalman Mlotek is one of the finest musical directors. His parent, Yossen Mlotek, and his mother, Chana Mlotek, wrote the trilogy of Pearls of Yiddish Song, the greatest anthology of Yiddish music that they researched and put together for folks. I mean, it's just, music, Yiddish music royalty.
Well, I have a dear friend down in New York City in Queens who sang in the Workman's Circle Choir under Zalman Mlotek.
Yeah, Zalman's great. I've known him for so long, and we've done lots of stuff together, and he's wonderful. And it was just a pleasure to go in and audition for him and all the New York casting directors.
Well, Theresa, it's been just a thrill conversing with you today, and I'm sure that our listeners will say the same thing. I'm sure they'll agree. And so, thank you again for joining me on Tete a Tete.
Kop's a cop. I thank you. Head to head. Kop's a cop. Thank you so much for having me.
So I want to go out with one final number. This is you, Theresa Tova, singing Telling Stories, the title track from your 2000 album.
And the opening and closing song from Still the Night.
You've told me your stories in clear black and white, but I know there's more than one way to see. I see shades of bright colors in the shadow and light. There's a rainbow inside of me. Mama, I'll tell the stories. Mama, I'll hold my head high. I'll make you the heroine you always should have been. Mama, I'll show the world why.
I'm Jonathan Slater, and you've been listening to Tete a Tete. Thank you for joining us today, and thanks to our guest, the incomparable Theresa Tova. This show was produced and edited by Theodora Draper in Toronto. Our music is provided by J.K. Bradley. Our executive producers are Joshua Tapper and David Kaufman. Tete a Tete is a podcast of the Association for Canadian Jewish Studies. You can find out more about the ACJS and link to our journal and past podcast episodes by checking out our website, acjs-aejc.ca. We're grateful to our supporters, the Israel and Golda Kashitsky Center for Jewish Studies, the Social Science and Humanities Research Council's Aid to Scholarly Journals program, and the J. Richard Schiff Chair for the Study of Canadian Jewry. In the show notes, you can find a transcript of my conversation with Theresa Tova and order print copies of current and past issues of the ACJS journal, Canadian Jewish Studies, Études Juives Canadiennes. You'll also find links to ticket information for Theresa's upcoming appearance in Fiddler on the Roof in Yiddish, as well as to Theresa's albums. We'd love it if you could share, like, and rate our podcast. You're also invited to add your email to the ACJS's occasional newsletter or support the ACJS's amazing work by following links in the show notes. If you have comments or thoughts about this podcast episode or any other of our episodes, feel free to email us at acjs@yorku.ca. Come back and join us for another conversation.